A thick wall of snow covered the frozen ground outside Moscow. German soldiers stood in silence, their breath turning into white clouds in the brutal cold. Just weeks earlier, many of them believed victory was certain. They had marched across Europe with unstoppable speed, Poland had fallen, France had collapsed, and now Adolf Hitler believed the Soviet Union would fall just as quickly. But something was about to happen that no one in the German high command had truly prepared for. The temperature was dropping fast, the supply lines were breaking down, and hidden in the forest and frozen villages, Soviet forces were preparing something that would shock the entire German army. What happened in the winter of 1941 would shatter Hitler's dream of conquering the East and change the entire course of World War II. Before we dive deeper into this dramatic moment in history, welcome to History Plus. If you enjoy powerful, true stories from World War II and want to understand the events that shaped our world, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these historical stories to life. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, it was the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. Thousands of tanks rolled forward. Aircraft filled the skies. The German strategy of blitzkrieg had already crushed several European nations, and many German commanders believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months. At first, everything seemed to confirm that belief. German armies advanced quickly across vast stretches of Soviet land. Entire Soviet units were surrounded and captured. Cities fell one after another. Millions of Soviet soldiers became prisoners. By late summer, the German army had already pushed hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. To many observers around the world, it looked like the Soviet Union might not survive the year. But the Soviet Union was much larger than Germany expected. The land seemed endless. Every mile the German army advanced made their supply lines longer and weaker. Roads were rough, railways were damaged, and trucks struggled to bring fuel, food, and ammunition to the front lines. Still, Hitler pushed his commanders to continue forward. He believed that capturing Moscow would destroy Soviet resistance completely. By the fall of 1941, the German army launched a massive push toward Moscow. This offensive was known as Operation Typhoon. German commanders hoped it would deliver the final blow. Tanks and infantry moved toward the Soviet capital from multiple directions. At first, it looked like they might succeed. Soviet defenses were under enormous pressure, and German forces came closer to Moscow than they had ever been. But something unexpected began to slow the German advance. Autumn rains turned roads into thick mud. Vehicles became stuck. Supply trucks struggled to move. Tanks moved slowly across the muddy terrain. This period became known as the Rasputitsa, the season of mud that has frustrated armies in Russia for centuries. Even with these challenges, German commanders believed victory was still possible. They continued pushing forward. But then the weather changed again, and this time it was far worse. Winter arrived earlier than expected, and the temperature began to drop to extreme levels. Many German soldiers were not prepared for the freezing conditions. Their uniforms were designed for European climates, not the brutal cold of the Russian winter. As temperatures fell to -30 degrees Celsius, and sometimes even lower, weapons froze. Engines refused to start. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and anything they could find to stay warm. Frostbite became common. Some soldiers could not even pull the trigger of their rifles because their fingers had gone numb. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was preparing its response. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had refused to abandon Moscow. Instead, he ordered massive defensive efforts around the city. Thousands of civilians helped dig trenches and build barriers. Factories worked day and night producing weapons and equipment. But perhaps the most important decision was bringing fresh troops from the far eastern regions of the Soviet Union. These soldiers were trained to fight in extreme winter conditions. Many came from Siberia, where temperatures were even colder than near Moscow. They were equipped with warm clothing, skis, and winter camouflage. They understood how to move and fight in deep snow. While German soldiers struggled to survive the Freezing temperatures, these Soviet forces were preparing for something unexpected. The German army believed the Soviets were close to collapse, but in reality, the Red Army was gathering strength for a powerful counterattack. In early December 1941, when the freezing winter had already weakened German positions, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh divisions suddenly attacked along the front lines near Moscow. German units that had been exhausted and frozen suddenly found themselves under heavy attack. For the first time since the invasion began, German forces were pushed backward on a large scale. Soviet soldiers advanced through forests and snow-covered fields, striking German positions again and again. Ski troops moved quickly across terrain where vehicles could barely move. German commanders were shocked. The army that had seemed unstoppable only months earlier was now struggling to hold its ground. Hitler refused to allow large retreats, ordering many units to stand and fight where they were. This decision placed enormous pressure on German soldiers, already suffering from the brutal winter. The battle around Moscow became a desperate struggle. Both sides fought fiercely in terrible conditions. Snowstorms, freezing winds, and icy ground turned the battlefield into a nightmare. But the Soviet counterattack had already achieved something important. It shattered the belief that Germany could win the war quickly. For the first time, the myth of the unstoppable German war machine began to break. The Red Army had shown that Germany could be stopped, even pushed back. And this winter battle would mark the beginning of a long and brutal struggle that would eventually lead all the way to Berlin. But the story of how the Red Army managed to push back one of the most powerful armies in the world was far from over. The coming weeks would bring even more dramatic fighting, desperate decisions, and a turning point that would change Hitler's Eastern dream forever. And that is where the next part of the story begins. The shock of the Soviet counterattack spread quickly through the German lines. Only weeks earlier, many German soldiers believed they were on the edge of victory. Some units had already seen the distant outlines of Moscow. But now, instead of advancing, they were suddenly fighting just to survive. The freezing wind cut through their uniforms, and every night the temperature dropped even further. German equipment was never designed for such extreme conditions. Tank engines froze overnight. Machine guns jammed. Even simple tasks became dangerous. Soldiers had to light small fires just to warm their weapons enough to work. Frostbite became one of the most common injuries on the entire front. Some soldiers lost fingers and toes simply because they could not stay warm long enough. At the same time, the Red Army began pushing harder. Fresh Soviet divisions kept arriving from Siberia and the Far East. These troops were trained for winter warfare. Many moved across the snow using skis, allowing them to travel faster than German vehicles stuck on frozen roads. Their white winter uniforms helped them blend into the snowy landscape, making surprise attacks much easier. German commanders were stunned by how organized the Soviet response had become. Instead of collapsing like many had predicted, the Soviet Union was fighting back with growing strength. Entire German units began to fall back as Soviet forces attacked from multiple directions. Villages that had been captured during the summer were now being lost again. Inside the German high command, tension was rising. Some generals warned that the army needed to pull back to stronger defensive positions. They knew the soldiers were exhausted, freezing, and running low on supplies. But Adolf Hitler refused to allow large retreats. He believed that holding the current positions was the only way to prevent a complete collapse of the front. So German soldiers stayed where they were, digging defensive positions in frozen ground that was almost impossible to break. Every day became a struggle against both the enemy and the brutal winter. Yet despite these hardships, the Soviet attacks continued to grow stronger. Here on History Plus, this moment is often remembered as the beginning of a major shift in the war. For the first time, the German army was no longer the unstoppable force that had swept across Europe. The winter of 1941 had changed the balance of power, and the Red Army was proving that the war in the East would not end quickly. And as the fighting around Moscow continued, the consequences of this brutal winter were only beginning to unfold. The next phase of the battle would push both armies to their limits and leave a lasting impact on the entire war. The fighting continued to grow more intense as December moved forward. German soldiers who had once believed the war would end quickly now found themselves trapped in endless snow and freezing temperatures. Every movement became slow and exhausting. Trucks could barely move across icy roads, and supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces were gaining confidence. Commanders of the Red Army saw that the German advance had finally stopped. This was the moment they had been waiting for. More troops were pushed into the battle, and coordinated attacks began to hit German positions again and again. Soviet artillery fired from hidden positions in forests, while infantry units moved quietly through the snow before launching sudden assaults. For many German soldiers, the psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical conditions. Only months earlier, they had marched across Europe with unstoppable momentum. Poland, France, and much of the continent had fallen quickly. But now they faced an enemy that refused to collapse. Reports from the front lines made it clear that the Red Army was not weakening. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with every passing week. Soviet commanders had learned from the early disasters of the war. Their defenses became more organized, and their counterattacks more aggressive. Here on History Plus, historians often point to this period as the moment when the illusion of an easy German victory in the East finally disappeared. The winter around Moscow had done something no other campaign had managed before. It forced the German army to stop. And once an army built on rapid conquest loses its momentum, the entire strategy begins to fall apart. What came next would prove that the battle for Moscow was not just another fight on the Eastern Front. It was the moment when the tide of the war quietly began to turn. By the time winter began to ease in early 1942, the German army had lost the unstoppable momentum it once had. The Red Army had not only survived the initial invasion but had pushed the Germans back from Moscow, proving that they could fight, adapt, and strike decisively even under the harshest conditions. The snow and cold had exposed the limits of Hitler's strategy, turning what was meant to be a quick victory into a prolonged struggle. The German army was forced to react rather than dictate, and the Red Army began gaining confidence and experience for the battles ahead. This frozen turning point set the stage for larger confrontations later in the war, including the epic struggles at Stalingrad and Kursk. It was here, in the snow outside Moscow, that the momentum of World War II began to shift irreversibly. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to share it with fellow history enthusiasts. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think was the real turning point of the Eastern Front? Your perspective matters, and it's always exciting to hear from viewers like you.